to shift gears now to this idea of psychological prisons and this issue of self-focused attention. So let me just first start with a kind of basic definition of self-focused attention. So I consider self-focused attention to be when the direction of your attention is inward. In other words, the object of your attention is primarily your thought, your feeling, or body sensations. So you can see in this slide, there's a person with a flashlight, and you can see that beam of light coming from the flashlight. And that's a reasonably good place to start as a metaphor for attention, that your attention is like that beam of light coming from the flashlight. So you can shine that attention outward on what's going on, for instance, in the next room or outside your window, or you can shine it inward on how you're feeling, whether you're comfortable or you have a headache right now, or a toothache, or you're a little bit cold because the heat isn't warm enough in your house. So we can think of attention as being directed either to something outside or something inside. Self-focused attention means we're directing our attention inward. And so this psychological prison, if we want to think of it that way, that we create for ourselves, really has this characteristic of my thoughts, my feelings, my problems, my disappointment, my aches and pains, my comfort, my convenience, my expectation. It's about me, 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 me. Right? And this is essentially the nature of our psychological prison, is that our attention is caught up to a great degree in focusing on ourselves. This is a quote from a Buddhist teacher, Reverend Kenro Kanematsu. If we were made to live in a world where our own self was the only factor to consider, then that would be the worst prison imaginable to us. For our deepest joy is growing greater, and is in growing greater and greater by more and more union with the all. So I'm going to share with you some studies on self-focused attention. Back in about 20 to 25 years ago, kind of pre-internet days, I would spend days at the Middlebury College Library here in Vermont. One of the things I researched was what research had been done on this theme of self-focused attention, not in Japanese psychology, which I already had some training in, but in Western psychology. And so these are just examples of some of the results of the studies that I came up with. Here you see a quote from a study published in Behavior Therapy by Jacobson and Anderson. Depressed people refer to themselves more frequently than do non-depressed people, even when the normal flow of conversation calls for more attention to the other person. Here's a study published in the Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience Journal. Socially anxious individuals tend to shift their attention away from external socially threatening cues and instead become highly self-focused. Such heightened self-focused attention has been suggested to be involved in the development and maintenance of social anxiety disorder. And I think this is probably the most interesting quote that I came up with by Rick Ingram. It was published in Psych Bulletin, that the weight of available evidence, the weight of available data clearly suggests an association between psychological disorder and self-focused attention, regardless of the disorder. In other words, virtually every psychological disorder is associated with this heightened degree of self-focused attention. So the cost of being in a psychological prison, right? The lack of sensory experience and engagement with the outside world, the sense of isolation, is that we struggle with psychological and emotional problems. We feel isolated, we are isolated from the natural world because our attention is on ourselves, on our internal world. We're more likely to make mistakes. Competence is associated with an outward focused kind of attention. Safety is associated with outward focused attention. There was an article that came out in a women's magazine years ago in which a woman went into a prison and she interviewed convicts who had been arrested for crimes against women. And she asked them this question: how did you pick your victims? And so many of them said the same thing, which was, I looked for women who were distracted. I looked for women who weren't paying attention to what was going on around them. And those became people that they would steal her purse or steal her car or physically assault her because they were looking for victims that were focused on what was going on inside themselves instead of around themselves. We struggle with a lack of gratitude because gratitude is a function of outward attention. We can't be grateful, feel grateful, unless we're paying attention to what people are doing for us around us. We have relationship struggles, and finally, the difficulty or inability to empathize with others. So all of this is a function of this self-focused attention. So the practical question is, how do we escape from that prison, the prison that we've created for ourselves because we spend so much time inside our heads, inside our minds, or attending to our feelings and discomfort? Well, the problem with a lot of traditional Western therapy is that if you think of attention as a skill, which I do, and I'll talk about this in a little while in terms of practice, it's something that you get good at by practicing it. And most of us, over time, have gotten too good at self-focused attention. So a successful therapeutic approach would basically teach somebody how to shift their attention away from their internal experience and onto the world around them. But a lot of traditional therapy is still very focused on getting the person to get in touch with their feelings, to talk about their problems, their difficulties, blaming other people in their lives. Again, it's all about self-focus. So we've come to associate therapy sessions with that kind of discussion. And again, it's not that it might not be helpful at times, but ultimately, for us to escape from that prison of self-focused attention, we have to work with our attention and become skillful at getting our attention off of ourselves. And it's all about practice. It's about actually conscious practice of being able to shift our attention away from, for instance, the little stories or the ideas or upsetting images of the future and anxieties that are going on in our mind, and shifting that attention to the outside world. And when we do, there's wonderful outcomes. Not only do we end up reducing our emotional and psychological suffering, but we find that the outside world is a really interesting place to live. And I would argue it's much more interesting than, for me at least, than what goes on in my mind. But to become skillful at that, we have to practice. And so a lot of the training that I do with people, and some of you have been through training with me, is about giving people exercises that allow you throughout the day, a normal day, to basically make that shift of attention. So I want to give you a couple of general themes of what you want to do to essentially get out of prison. And then we'll go ahead and kind of open things up to comments and questions and discussion. But I think one of the most important things you can do in terms of learning to work with your attention is to cultivate a sense of curiosity about the world around you. It's really amazing to be with someone who is just fundamentally curious about things around them, about what they look like, what they feel like, how things work, how mechanical objects work. So we start to shift our attention and we start to notice the world. But curiosity is more than just noticing something. It's really investigating what you're noticing. This is a quote from the Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron.